In this video, I'm going to be discussing the skeletal muscle anatomy, and we're going to be looking at the different types of connective tissue that make up skeletal muscle. And to begin with, the basic definition of skeletal muscle is that it is voluntary muscle. There are motor neurons that will attach to these muscles throughout your body, and they'll release neurotransmitters, namely acetylcholine, that will cause these muscles to contract or relax accordingly so that you can make voluntary movements such as raising your hand. And if we look at a basic anatomy diagram, many of us have probably seen this before. We see these images right here, and what happens when we take a cross section of this image? So what we get is this thing to the left, and the first thing that we're going to make a note of is that the whole muscle is surrounded in this tissue called the epimysium. Epi meaning above, and then mysium. So this covers the whole thing, and it's composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. And so I'll get to what that means in a little bit. Now, what we're going to make a note of is how we see a bunch of these little bundles within the muscle. And each one of these bundles is called a fascicle. Fascicle. Okay? And these fascicles are containers of many individual cells. And each fascicle is lined with an additional connective tissue called the Epimysium. So the Epimysium in this case is this yellow thing that kind of covers our fascicle, and it is also composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. Now, as we look deeper within the fascicle, what we're going to find are these things called myofibers. And these myofibers are multinucleated cells. And this might come off as weird because the definition of a cell has one cell, one nucleus, but what makes myofibers interesting is the fact that they come from many individual cells that will fuse their plasma membranes together, and so one myofiber, which we technically call one cell, actually consists of many nuclei. Okay, and so what lines each myofiber is something called the endomysium, and it is irregular connective tissue. Okay, and so this is going to be the basic anatomy behind what you're looking at if you take a cross section of skeletal muscle and look at it under a microscope. And then these little red things, for the sake of completeness, would just be a capillary or some kind of artery to deliver oxygen and glucose, as well as the neurotransmitters appropriate for that muscle contraction to the individual cells. So we've been introduced to these new terms: dense, irregular connective tissue, as well as irregular connective tissue. And what I have here are microscope slides of the two tissue types. And so the first tissue type we looked at was dense, irregular connective tissue. And so the first thing to make a note of is that what we're seeing here is mostly collagen. And that's where this dense term what it comes from. And this irregular term, what that's referring to is the fact that we don't see parallel lines, so it's disordered. And in addition to that, what you should take away with dense irregular connective tissue is the fact that there are few cells here. We only see a couple of cells, and the cell types are called fibroblasts. And so these fibroblasts are the cells that are going to be secreting these collagen proteins, these quaternary proteins outside the cell in these disordered fashions in order to help bind cells and tissues together. Okay, so that was the Paramysium, as well as the Epimysium. And what we see in the slide to the right here is something referred to as irregular connective tissue. And so we can see the stark contrast between these two slides, namely the lack of collagen fibers that we're seeing here, and you'll commonly see this as loose connective tissue. And the purpose of irregular connective tissue is to hold water and salts. And so what we know about muscle contraction, when acetylcholine is released from a motor neuron onto a muscle, the sarcoplasmic reticulum within the muscle cell is going to release calcium ions, and those calcium ions are going to be working with the troponin and tropomyosin in order to allow the myosin heads to form the cross bridges with the actin filaments. And so there is a very big need for the salts within your muscle cells if you're about to contract. So if you're contracting a lot, you're going to want your muscle cells to be in an environment in which they have access to those calcium salts, those other salts that they need in order to receive the action potentials and neurotransmitters from the motor neurons. Okay, so that's going to wrap things up for this basic breakdown of skeletal muscle anatomy. I hope you guys find it useful. Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.